Hello and welcome to this teach-in on the war in Ukraine at the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia, the University of Michigan. My name is Geneviève Zubrzycki. I'm director of WCEE, and I have the pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Professor Ron Suny, the William H. Sewell Jr. Distinguished University Professor of History. He's the author of several important books on the Russian Revolution, Stalinism, the Soviet experiment, nationalism and the collapse of the Soviet Union, as well as on Russia's empires. Professor Suny will be speaking to us about lessons from history, Ukraine and Russia. Professor Suny, welcome.
Basically, the world changed in the early morning of February 24th, 2022, when Vladimir Putin launched an unprovoked attack on Russia's neighbor, Ukraine. War is a sign of human failure, a failure of human reason, of negotiation, compromise. It's a failure of diplomacy. There are different kinds of war. You can think of an imperial war, say Hitler in World War II, a war to conquer and expand your country, your power and influence. You might add the United States in the Spanish-American War. There could be a defensive war after an attack, like Pearl Harbor in 1941, or the USSR in World War II, and Russia in Georgia in 2008, at least they would say so. There's also preemptive war, which is a response by a state to clear mobilization for war by an enemy state. Some people would say that was Israel in 1967. And finally, there's preventive war, a war launched because you imagine the other side will become a threat in the future. The United States' second invasion of Iraq in 2003, you remember those weapons of mass destruction that never existed? These preventive wars are wars of choice. Indeed, many of these that we are seeing in the world today, like this invasion of Ukraine, is a war of choice. Putin's war, and it's Putin's, not Russia in my view, is a preventive war aimed at removing an imagined threat, a future threat from the West, NATO, and from the United States through Ukraine. And then there are things called preventive wars, that is, wars launched because one side imagines that the other side will become a threat in the future. Like the US's second invasion of Iraq in 2003, the weapons of mass destruction, do you remember that? These are called wars of choice. Indeed, Russia's war is a war of choice, but the dispute is whether it is an imperial war, that Russia is out to recreate some kind of empire, or that Russia indeed is preventing what it thinks is a threat in the future from Ukraine, from NATO, etc. Now think about it. Russia is the largest country in the world. So by its very existence, straddling Europe and Asia, it presents a security dilemma to other states just by existing. It's too big. It's 4 times bigger than the European Union, it's the largest country in the world. But the fact is, it's a relatively weak state, economically and militarily, except in comparison to its immediate neighbors. They say the first casualty of war is the truth, but I say it's often what is left out. A half-truth is not a true statement. History, and I'm proud to be a historian, is both a contested and a subversive social science. And we see it being used and misused by governments and pundits and propagandists. But for historians, it's also a way to find out what happened in the past and why, how we got where we are and where we might be going. But as a search for truth in this postmodern age when everyone is doubting such a thing as truth, history becomes subversive of convenient and comfortable but inaccurate views of the past, the present, and possible futures. Let me present 2 narratives, 2 different versions of reality which exist at the moment, staring across a deep divide neither conceding any truth to the other. The first story, the first narrative, I call this a Manichaean one. That is a fancy term for black and white, good guys versus bad guys, like the narratives about the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And this is the more widespread and familiar one in the West, particularly in the United States. And it's one that has now become dominant and is likely to be hegemonic in the near future. And the view is something like this. Russia is and has always been an expansionist state. And its current president, Vladimir Putin, is the very embodiment of that essential Russian ambition to build a new Russian empire, or in Putin's own mind, to restore the former Soviet Union. In this narrative, it is not Russia's national interests that are the driving factors, its security concerns, but the personal fantasies of Putin and his closest cronies. Such a view has most recently been expressed not only by the familiar Russophobic pundits and politicians, but after the Russian invasion of Ukraine by President Joe Biden himself on February 24th, the invasion day. He said, now the entire world sees clearly what Putin and his Kremlin allies are really all about. This was never about genuine security concerns on their part. It was always about naked aggression, about Putin's desire for empire by any means necessary, by bullying Russia's neighbors through coercion and corruption, unquote. And this morning in the New York Times, the moderately conservative pundit David Brooks wrote that these are all Putin's fantasies about identity politics. In this narrative, NATO, which we remember was formed in 1949 to contain the USSR and the spread of communism, the view now in the West is that NATO is not an anti-Russian alliance, but is instead a kind of collective security agreement aimed at protecting its members from outside aggression and peaceful mediation of conflicts within the alliance, just in case Turkey and Greece want to go to war again. Recognizing the sovereignty of all states and their right to ally absolutely with whatever state they wish, NATO acceded over time to the requests of European democracies, which began, by the way, right after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, to join this alliance. Even though former members of the Soviet-established Cold War Warsaw Pact and 3 former Soviet republics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, were brought into NATO in 2004, the Kremlin is supposed to understand and accept that the war games that go on with American tanks in the Baltic states, or the rockets stationed in Poland and Romania, which the US says are aimed at Iran, in no way present a threat to Russian security. The West furthermore claims that it opposes all spheres of influence, and Putin's request for special rights, like the guarantee that Ukraine and Georgia not join NATO, is seen as an illegitimate claim to imperial rights over its neighbors, a restoration of the Cold War division of the world into spheres of influence. In this first narrative, there's no recognition here of Latin America and the Monroe Doctrine as essentially an American sphere of influence, or recognition that NATO's 30-nation alliance might be considered an armed sphere of influence confronting Russia. As international relations scholar Steve Walt put it, the near total consensus it's all Russian President Vladimir Putin's fault. Russia's stated grievances have no legitimate basis whatsoever, and the only conceivable Western response is to refuse to make any concessions, stand up to Moscow, send more US troops to Europe, though not to Ukraine itself, and proceed with tough economic sanctions if Russia invades, unquote. That's become the dominant narrative in the West. But there's a second narrative, and I call this one, "It takes two to tango." The opposing narrative argues that Russia's security concerns are in fact genuine, as has been expressed repeatedly not only by Putin, but by other Russian leaders, NATO expansion eastward is seen by Russians as directed against their country. And Putin has been clear that if continued, this expansion would likely be met with serious resistance by the Russians, even with military action. Russian elite and broad public opinion have both long been opposed to the progressive phases of NATO expansion, certainly against the placement of American rockets in Poland and Romania, and the arming of Ukraine with Western weaponry. In this second narrative, the way out of confrontation and war requires something that's been called strategic empathy, recognition of your opponent's conceptions, not necessarily agreeing with them, but recognizing them so that you can find a way to find an appropriate response to their concerns. Now, that perspective is dominant in the Russian security thinking, but it's not only held by Russians. Some influential American policy experts have subscribed to it as well, including the late George Kennan, who at age 100, Kennan, of course, being the father of containment during the Cold War, said that NATO expansion was a terrible mistake. I'm going to tell you the story of one well-placed American diplomat, and he was a political officer in the US Embassy in Moscow. And in 1995, just as we were thinking of expanding NATO, this officer wrote, "Hostility to early NATO expansion is almost universally felt across the domestic political spectrum here in Russia." And then when the Bill Clinton administration moved to bring Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic into NATO, this same counselor, now for public political affairs, wrote that this decision was, quote, "premature at best and needlessly provocative at worst," unquote. And he continued, "As Russians stewed in their grievance and sense of disadvantage, a gathering storm of stab in the back theories slowly swirled, leaving a mark on Russia's relations with the West that would linger for decades," unquote. That same officer is William J. Burns. And when he was ambassador to Moscow, and today he is the director of our own CIA, but he wrote in 2008 to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, quote, "Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite, not just Putin. In more than 2.5 years of conversations with key Russian players, from knuckle draggers in the dark recesses of the Kremlin to Putin's sharpest liberal critics, I have yet to find anyone who views Ukraine and NATO as anything other than a direct challenge to Russia's interest," unquote. Even Boris Yeltsin, who was a friend of Clinton and the Americans, when he was already feeble, the end of his tenure, looking out at the world through an alcoholic haze, he repeatedly protested the enlargement of NATO. Now, what's important are the consequences of these two narratives. If you think the war in Ukraine is indeed the work of a determined imperialist, a restorer of the Soviet Union, then any actions you take of defeating the Russians will look like the 1938 Munich-style appeasement, and Joe Biden becomes the reviled Neville Chamberlain, the British prime minister who acceded to Hitler's demands for territory in Czechoslovakia, only to find himself deceived as the Nazis steadily marched to war. If, however, you believe, and it's becoming more and more difficult to believe, that Russia has legitimate concerns about NATO expansion, then the door is open to discussion, negotiation, compromise, and concessions. But think how difficult that is once the war has been launched. In other words, Putin himself, by negotiating for months with the West, with a gun to the head of the West, made it difficult to make those concessions. And then once he pulled that trigger and launched this war, it's now become nearly impossible, and it's Ukrainians who indeed are paying the price. Let me try in a way to talk about how Putin actually thinks. Now, I believe those security concerns are genuine in Putin's mind. I think, and many commenters like Condoleezza Rice and Robert Gates, who was our Secretary of Defense, have thought, this is a different Putin right now. He was always acting like a 19th century realist. He was ruthless, yes, but he was unsentimentally and amorally considering the power differentials between states. He looked for possible allies ready to take Russia's interests seriously. He called us partners. Recently, by the way, he found such an ally in China, which is probably the biggest geopolitical shift that we're now experiencing. But he also made it clear that Russia would be willing to resort to armed force, as it did in Georgia in 2008, when it believes that the country is threatened. But nowadays, he also may be acting on the basis of his ideological predilections, which he reveals in fabricated histories of Russia and the Soviet Union. Occasionally, Putin has acted impulsively, in my view, as when he seized Crimea in 2014, and rashly and almost irrationally, as in his disastrous decision to invade Ukraine without fully weighing the consequences of such action. In other words, he may be, in fact, believing his own propaganda. What are some of the thoughts that Russia and Putin must be aware of and have articulated? This one he would never say, but he knows it. Russia's a weak state. NATO spends 20 times what Russia spends on defense. Russian defense spending is 8% of America's defense spending. Russia's economy is about the size of California, half the size of California. It's about the size of Texas. This is a relatively weak state, though strong vis-a-vis its neighbors. Putin has talked about what we call officially, in international relations theories, strategic depth. That is, you want a territory between your country and what you perceive to be your hostile enemies. And during the Cold War, the Soviet Union had extensive strategic depth because it had a kind of imperial hold over the countries of Eastern Europe, as well as the countries like Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic countries, all which were part of the Soviet Union. But things changed as NATO began to expand. Putin's sense of Russia's insecurity vis-a-vis a much more powerful NATO, I believe, is genuine, and he has acted on that in the most ill-considered way. The invasion is a blunder, a crime. It's a terrible mistake for the world, certainly for Ukraine, but also for Russia as well. In some sense, this whole conflict is a contest between Putin's determination and interest in being an effective, influential regional power in his own neighborhood. He wants to be what we might call a regional hegemon. But he believes that the West, particularly the United States, has much greater ambitions. It wants to be a global hegemon. It wants to have influence in the South China Sea, in the Mediterranean, the Middle East, Latin America, and all through Europe, pushing Russia, at least in Putin's view, back into underdevelopment, pushing Russia back into Asia. So Putin in his histories has now adopted, now whether he really believes this, which could be true, or it's just propaganda for domestic consumption, we'll find out. But Putin has adopted what might be called the imperial gaze of the czars. First of all, that Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians are actually Yedini Narod, one people bound by shared history and culture and related languages. In the West, that statement has been interpreted as giving the right of Moscow to take over Ukraine, one people, one state. And much of Ukraine, in his view, is actually historically Russian land, Novorossiya, New Russia, conquered by Catherine the Great from wild Tatars and Cossacks, a land that for centuries has been fought over and protected by Russia. And let's not forget, Russia was converted to Orthodox Christianity in Crimea by Vladimir the Great, says Vladimir the not so great. So this is an old view of Russian history. It's an imperial view. And it's one that Putin increasingly may be taking more seriously, and that has to be considered. Now, if Russia and Ukraine are one people, how do you justify bombing the cities of your brothers, your brother people, and killing civilians. You need another narrative. And what's the narrative? These are not real Ukrainians. They are being led by Nazis, by neo-Nazis, by an illegitimate government, by puppets of the West. And that, in other words, a totally far-fetched artificial discourse has been created, which, by the way, many Russians in Russia, with their restrained ability to receive truthful information, are believing this. I've talked to many Russians. Young people are resisting. They have other kinds of access, but the older generation, many of them are buying this view that somehow there is an alien force, Nazis. And why Nazis? Nazis go back to the center of Russia's sense of national identity. The revolution, oh, Putin threw that out. Lenin is an enemy now. Maybe Stalin not so bad, but Lenin out. What is the center of Russia's identity? It's World War II. It's the colossal struggle, which we all should applaud, of the Soviet Union against Nazism, where they faced 3/4 of the Nazi forces, where they defeated the Germans, took Berlin, where they liberated the camps in Poland like Auschwitz, ended the Holocaust. And indeed, it was Russia, the Soviet Union, that after World War II made, ironically, paradoxically, against their own will, the world safe for Western capitalism and democracy. So there we are. That's what the world is looking like. These narratives talk across each other. They don't see each other. And the roadmap out, the off-ramp is hard to find at this particular moment. We have to think more creatively about the way we tell ourselves stories. We have to look deep into history to understand the other fellow's point of view and hopefully try to find some way to end this horrendous, horrific war.
Thank you, Ron. Thanks for your analysis, presenting both the history of the tension between Russia or the Soviet Union and the West, incarnated now by NATO, but also the opposing narratives or analyses that people are presenting about the conflict. I would like to ask Will Kilm, who's an undergrad in public policy, to ask the first question. Let me see, I will unmute you. Yeah, you can be unmuted. Okay, Will.
Yeah, thank you. That was a very entertaining talk. Hello, my name is Will. I'm currently doing international relations theory and U.S. foreign policy at the Ford School. And there's a lot of mention about Stephen Walt as well as Mearsheimer, who is the biggest voice when it comes to the other interpretation that NATO expansion is what caused the aggression by the Russian state in Ukraine. But given his previous work in offensive realist theory and the specific interpretation of the security dilemma, which erases the distinction between offense and defense, and asserts that really every state is a regional hegemony seeking revisionist power, wouldn't you say that this is actually a contradiction within its own argument? Because by his own logic, every state, include whether it's NATO or whether it's Russia, they would want to maximize their hegemony independent of what the other state is doing, right? Because they would also, the United States would have its own Monroe Doctrine, and Russia would have its own Monroe Doctrine. And I believe this point was also raised by William Wolforth and Paul Post and other scholars who believe that realists are, they're contradictory when it comes to their prescriptive and descriptive view on this topic.
That is a great question, Will. And I can see education is really taking place at the University of Michigan. I really like that question. So John Mearsheimer and Steve Walt were both colleagues of mine when I taught for 11 years at the University of Chicago. We had offices across, and I learned a great deal from them. My own view in the liberal versus hard realist or offensive realist schools of international relations takes what I call a radical middle position. And my radical middle position is usually called constructivism. And what that means is you have to take seriously how states see themselves, what their identities are, and from their identities, then comes their sense of what their interests are. So unlike Mearsheimer, I don't believe there are objective, fixed, Palmerstonian kind of interests that always exist, but rather states create their own interests as they imagine who they are and who the enemy is. So the United States has a very grand view of itself. America sees itself as a exceptional state. We are unique, we are indispensable. These are the terms that they use. And therefore our interests, democratization, freedom, capitalism, which they don't say so much about, is equivalent to, magically, with the interests of every other state in the world. And there are other states, these less powerful states, like China, Iran, like sometimes European powers, certainly like Russia, that see themselves as saying, no, no, we don't want a single unipolar hegemon globally. We want also to have some say in our own regions toward Georgia or toward Ukraine. And so for Putin, he sees the American goals, their global hegemonic aspirations, as illegitimate and dangerous, as do many international relations theorists, and sees the regional ones as legitimate. But the Americans refuse to recognize that.
Ron, you have 2 minutes. I'm going to pose one question, and if you can be as brief as possible. And for those of you who ask questions that I'm not asking now, I can see that I can bring it up. I can pose your question a little later in other sections of the teach-in. So one is by Christopher Lovelace. What do you believe prompted Putin to invade Ukraine again now? What changed? He could have picked any other time, theoretically. So not why, but the why now?
That is the most difficult question. Think about it. Even Zelensky, if we can understand what he was saying, said this wasn't going to happen. That is, many people thought, even Mearsheimer, by the way, said it's improbable that he'll do it. He could do it. It's not impossible. And I certainly did not believe he would, because it's so costly to everyone, including Russia. And yet he did it. So why? Remember, Putin started mobilizing those troops around Ukraine 4 months ago, right? And he was pushing the West to react, and they didn't react. They took a relatively, at least the Americans and the NATO leadership, a hard line toward Russia. They weren't going to make any significant concessions. Macron tried, they talked about Minsk II, they talked about, a neutral Ukraine, but no move made. And there were, Putin saw this as an impossible scenario. And so he launched, and I think incredibly mistakenly, this invasion of Ukraine.
So there was one question that I thought also, two that I'm going to join. One is by Jared Eno and another one by Rich Valavender, who are about Putin himself, right? So is there like some kind of psychological breakdown? That's something we've also heard a lot about in the news, that COVID isolated him, et cetera, that he's become isolated, paranoid. And then, so Jared is asking, are there power struggles within Russia that could help explain Putin's recklessness? That is, could the war be partly to shore up Putin's position domestically?
Wow, I'm so impressed by these questions and by our students. A couple of things. I can't psychoanalyze Putin. When I watched the speeches that he gave, I watched them in Russian, I watched them on video, I watched his body language, and what I thought was, this guy is a consummate performer. Great leaders are performers. I didn't have any sympathy for Donald Trump, that narcissistic kleptomaniac, but still, he was a great performer. Mr. Biden, not so great, but that happens. Zelensky, an incredible performer. And it's not, I'm not saying performer to mean to undermine it, but you have to have that charisma, that persona in moments of crisis. And Zelensky certainly has that. And Putin, in those performances that he gave, particularly the one before the Security Council, where he, as a kind of czar, as a kind of autocrat, talked down to these Lilliputians, so Putin versus Lilliputians, and talk to them as if they were children of some kind, even embarrassing Narishkin, his chief of foreign intelligence. I mean, it was quite extraordinary. And it showed the power relation between the two. So this is definitely Putin's war. Has he lost it? No, he's probably very frustrated. He's isolated, all of those things. That maybe it's the COVID, but he probably has a vision. I think it's a distorted vision. But if he's crazy or he's paranoid in the clinical sense, then there's no negotiating. There's no way to get through that. So we have to be careful that we don't demonize him. There are many popular people in the punditry world that call him Adolf Hitler, right? I'm a person who subscribed to Jon Stewart's view of Hitler. The only person we should call Hitler is Adolf Hitler and nobody else. That was singular. We learned a lot and mislearned a lot from that experience.
Thank you so much for being with us this morning. I hope you can stay on or come back for the last panel. We invite everyone to stay, but of course we understand that you can leave and come back.